Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the novel Desperate Characters by Paula Fox. Welcome to The Reading Cure, where great books and great ideas are what we like to prescribe. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Now, Desperate Characters is a novel written by Paula Fox, first published in 1970, which tells the story of Sophie and Otto Bentwood, an affluent couple living in a gentrified street in Brooklyn in the late 1960s. In the first chapter, Sophie is bitten by a stray cat she's been feeding in their garden, much to Otto's consternation, and this elicits the fear that she may have contracted rabies. The disturbing incident comes to symbolise the couple's sense of vulnerability to a seemingly hostile neighbourhood and indeed society more generally, and it's succeeded by a series of events over the course of a long weekend that serve to further increase their feelings of anxiety and isolation. Otto, who is a lawyer, is undergoing a seemingly irreparable dispute with his long-term friend and business partner, Charlie. Sophie confesses to Charlie at one point that she has had an affair a number of years previously, and like Charlie, finds Otto's detached and rigid nature to be somewhat infuriating. Sophie's ongoing ambivalence about seeking medical attention for her cat bite persists for much of the weekend, which culminates in a disastrous trip with Otto to their vacation home in Flinders. Upon arriving, they discover that the house has been trashed, presumably by local youths, and this serves to shatter Otto's faith in the possibility of achieving lasting order and security in their life. The couple's relationship becomes increasingly strained as they struggle to empathise with each other, and their habitual patterns seem to be increasingly unravelling. Desperate Characters is an astute and masterfully written novel that explores the complexities of marriage, the human condition, and the search for meaning in a world that can often seem baffling and even hostile. So turning now to the author of this novel, Paula Fox was an American author whose literary career spanned over 5 decades. She was born in New York City in 1923 and had a difficult childhood, which included abandonment by her parents and time spent in various foster homes. Despite these challenges, Fox developed a love for reading and writing at a young age, and she eventually went on to earn a degree in English from Columbia University. Fox's writing often explored themes of displacement, identity, and the complexities of human relationships. She wrote both children's books and novels for adults, with her work often receiving critical acclaim. In 1974, she was awarded the Newbery Medal for her children's book The Slave Dancer, and in 1978 she received the Hans Christian Andersen Award, which is the highest international recognition for a body of work in children's literature. Despite her success as a writer, Fox remained somewhat enigmatic and private throughout her life, and she passed away in March of 2017 at the age of 93. Okay, so the first question we've got, Alec, is really about the title of the novel, Desperate Characters. Obviously, explicitly within the novel, there is a reference to the famous Thoreau quote about the mass of men leading lives of quiet desperation. I'm wondering in what sense you think the characters in this novel would be desperate, as the author Paula Fox might have seen it.
Yeah, well, off the top of my head, what comes to mind is that there is this idea of the, civilization as order. And then there's this idea of decay and chaos in the novel, as a kind of grand theme. And I have this sense that one of the main ways in which the Bentwoods, Otto and Sophie, are desperate is that they see themselves as trying to maintain, these forces of civilization as they see it anyway. I mean, yeah. I'm sure that that Paula Fox is satirizing it and critiquing it in some way. But I think as far as they see it, they're trying to be the civilized ones in a civilization that is breaking down, and that leads to this sense of desperation, of trying to hold things together really. This is something that's instigated or exacerbated, is probably a more accurate way of putting it, by the bite, from the cat that Sophie suffers, that could be possibly rabid. And, near the end of the novel, Sophie thinks, well, if she has rabies, then, her rabies matches the outer world, the rapid world outside. So there's this sense of trying to be civilized in a world that is quite rabid, really, as they see it.
That's interesting. Yeah, indeed. I think that's interesting that you've really picked up on this, on the kind of social context. I think you're quite right. I mean, I think the sort of symbolism of the cat bite is so central to that, as we'll come to. I thought what was interesting. I wouldn't normally necessarily do this, but I looked up a couple of definitions of the word desperate just to get a kind of sense of how it might fit here. And there's a few I'll maybe just read you that I thought were interesting. You've got feeling or showing a hopeless sense that a situation is so bad as to be impossible to deal with, which I thought, yeah, you could see that. Also, though, I thought it was interesting that when desperation is applied to a person, the definition is having a great need or desire for something, and also applied to a situation extremely serious or dangerous. And so I kind of wondered about the different almost meanings of the term desperate. I mean, like Sophie, for example, she's such an interesting character, really, because her situation, this kind of almost, I mean, I think the writer Jonathan Franzen, who did the foreword in the book, describes her as being like a Hamlet kind of character, which I thought was an interesting take, because she really is this kind of passionate and intuitive, but very uncertain, quite passive and unfulfilled person, kind of lacking a kind of meaning and direction, really, in this, obviously, both the relationship she has with Otto, as well as the kind of socioeconomic situation she's in, both of these are actually kind of precarious, so there's kind of a desperate quality to, different dimensions in her life. There's a lot of desperation, I guess, is what I was kind of seeing in it.
Yeah, well, I think that, in the novel, they link up the inner sense of desperation with that wider kind of desperate situation that's in society at the time.
Yeah.
And this idea that civilization, as they see it, is something that is a difficult and unsteady achievement. It can easily unravel, and I think that the characters feel that the relationship could possibly unravel, as well, as well as actually their own impulses, because Sophie is someone that has learned to become very inhibited in many senses, and I think part of it is to do with being married to Otto. But of course, when you hear about her upbringing and her relationship with her mother, where she was kind of taught various lessons quite sternly, that she's someone that thinks that if she spontaneously shows her emotions or spontaneously acts on impulses, that's wrong in some way. I think one of the most telling details about her is at that moment when she's bit by the stray cat, that she doesn't let out a yet. She's tempted to, but she holds it back, because even in that moment she's thinking about how Otto might actually react to her crying out, and she doesn't want to draw attention to her pain, because she's rather self-effacing in many ways.
I think that's a great point. I mean, there is this real conflictedness in her because I was thinking about, for example, when Otto's business partner, or, about to separate from him, the other lawyer, Charlie, he turns up, and initially Sophie's quite excited by the nighttime adventure, where they go out to a bar to talk about things, and it's very spontaneous, and, you can see that appeals to her on a certain level, but it's kind of also riddled with doubt about the whole thing. Afterwards, she's really feeling quite ambivalent about whether or not she should have acted on that impulse, because, as you said, she's really trained herself not to, actually, through both her mother and Otto as well.
She obviously is, as you say, quite excited by this break in routine, Charlie Russell turning up in the early hours of the morning. But, when they actually go to a bar, she confesses, although she doesn't give the full story, about her affair to Charlie, which is obviously quite a misguided thing to do, given how Charlie and Otto's professional relationship and personal relationship as friends is unraveling. But this is a point where she actually acts on impulse, and I think the way I read it is that Paula Fox might be saying this is someone that is so unskilled or so unused to acting on impulse that when she does it in this quite unwise way. I mean, not that necessarily that relaying about the affair leads to any consequences directly in the novel, although it could, out with the framework of the novel, in Sophie's future be an issue, because maybe Charlie would tell Otto. I don't know. But this is someone that doesn't really quite have a wisdom to acting on impulse. It's quite sporadic and unwise, clumsy. Really.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, yeah, you're right. She does get a little bit carried away, blurt this out, immediately regrets it when she sees his reaction, because she knows, actually, in terms of the reading we seem to get of Charlie's character, is that he's angry at Otto, but he's also been a loyal friend, and he's hurt by him. So yeah, this isn't necessarily a very clever thing to confess. I thought it was interesting as well, though, because Charlie's the character who the desperate reference in the Thoreau quote, it comes from him, and in that scene, he says actually to Sophie, "Are you desperate?" And her response, I noted down here, I thought was interesting. She says, "I don't know. I suppose I need something to do. I'm too idle." That kind of listless, she can't even really quite articulate whether she'd consider herself desperate or not. And that kind of vacillation in her kind of energy levels, but resigned state and then these moments of passion, that seems to be quite defining in terms of how she is, but deep down quite an energetic person,
yes,
I think, but passionate soul.
Yeah, quite possibly. But as you say, it's not as though she feels desperate all the time. It's not like she's a pressure cooker just looking to release certain, feelings. Not. I mean, it seems as though other times she can feel quite, happy or even just rather neutral.
Yes.
And I suppose that's a very realistic element of the novel. I think also the desperation is indicative of the alienation that the characters can feel from each other as well, and this trying to, particularly Sophie, to almost break down Otto's defenses to reach him in some ways. There is a kind of desperation there, because it isn't sustained and it doesn't really succeed much at all.
Indeed. Well, I think that's right. I mean, there is a kind of ongoing attempt, sometimes with little bursts of anger, which never really last very long, to just try and get through to him. And there's also a kind of ongoing attempt to try and decipher him, really, because in the scene much later in the novel where she finds he's come down in the night, he's underlined something in a book about I think it was the riots that happened in the 1400s, where these teenagers were hung, and he's underlined "to vindicate the law." And then she thinks about 7 possible interpretations as to why he might have done that, with obviously this fear that he's so abstract and fixated on the principle that he's missing the kind of human dimension of it all. But even there, she's not really sure. I think there was a good quote round about that where she says something about, "We've been married for 15 years, but out with the dynamics of this, I don't know if I really do know this guy." And it's that doubt.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that for Sophie, there's that desperation that comes from at times feeling that she knows Otto only too well, almost like a very clear sense of who he is, and then at other times that he, as you say, seems quite indecipherable. So she sort of vacillates from being bewildered to being too knowing, and I think again that's quite a realistic aspect of the novel, when you've got 2 very intelligent characters that they might feel at times they really know each other. Sometimes that's not a good thing, and at other times that they're a mystery to the other. And we see that with Sophie, that she is trying to work out who he really is.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a very, very subtle and realistic and deep depiction of characters, actually. Jonathan Franzen describes her, as I said, Hamletian in a way. I think he calls her morbidly self-conscious. She is this intellectual that's also a little bit low energy, but gets a little bit lost in these ruminations or analysis of herself, of Otto, and never really been, as you say, sometimes she can predict his habits, with incredible astuteness, but at other times he slightly goes against the grain, and then she's puzzled again. So there's something really realistic about that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. He says morbidly introspective. I mean, that may be true, because you could make the argument that if people don't ask enough, directly, that then they have to start surmising what the meaning of things are. A bit like in a Henry Green novel, that as you're reading it, you are exercising your interpretive capacities, because the characters are not very direct about what they're thinking or feeling. And clearly because of her introversion and inhibition, which are, and of course these things aren't the same thing, but in her case she has those two dimensions to her character, that she has to interpret things a lot of the time, because she's not quite keen on acting or asking Otto. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, like when she asks him, does he take stock of the female clients, how they look, but he doesn't take her up on that.
Yes.
And that's one of the most direct things that she says to him, where her curiosity gets the better of her. But I think one of the most interesting things about her is that she always has this kind of masochism to her, like how she endures the pain, how she doesn't go and get herself checked out to see whether she needs shots. So she endures this pain and uncertainty, but also she's got this real fear and foreboding as well. Those two aspects to her. Like she seems to want to endure pain, but other times she's fleeing from pain as well.
I absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that her ongoing action or lack of regarding the cat bite, because in the initial scene, part of it to me anyway seemed like essentially there's a little bit of a power dynamic with her and Otto, insofar as he's told her that's silly, you shouldn't be petting that cat, and in a way he's just been proved right, and she doesn't, there's an element of not necessarily wanting to concede that. But I think there's a lot more to it than that in terms of her passivity, because as you said, she is worried about it, and lots of people keep advising her to get it looked at, and she makes a half-hearted effort at times. But there's a kind of vacillation, I suppose, between almost like procrastinating or wanting to forget about it, and then extreme fear. It's a strange one.
Well, and I think, if we're seeing it from a Freudian perspective, that Freud, had argued that one of the prices of being civilized is that, we can moralize our pain. I mean, he didn't put it quite in that way, but we can take, pain as a form of self-punishment if you've got a sense of guilt. So it's almost like you get a sense that she feels that she should endure this in some ways, as well as be very frightened about the consequences of not getting it treated. So there's this real ambivalence about pain and her own well-being, really.
I think that's true. It's interesting as well. It almost seemed a bit like it was a kind of moment of trauma for her, really, because obviously she is so scathing of Otto's detached, supposed reasonable, rational way of and kind of unempathetic way of dealing with people in situations. And she's quite, one thing she seems assertive about to a degree is the rightness of her more empathetic, caring approach. That's obviously what drives her kind of round the bend about him. But when she reaches out in a kind, gentle way to this cat, and then just out the blue, it bites her. It's like that in some ways violated her security in the world, because that just almost shouldn't happen. I can't. There was a good quote about it. There's so many good quotes in this novel. I can't really quite find that one at the moment. But you know what I mean. There was something really. It seemed traumatic and momentous about that the impact of that act on her.
Yeah, I mean, it did seem like she didn't expect it at all, that because she was actually feeding the cat, helping the cat, that it would not actually respond by biting her so savagely. So there is this kind of thing of almost like assuming that the stray cat was following a social code, like the code of civilization. You help your neighbor out, your neighbor doesn't shoot you, say, or something like that.
Yeah.
You assume that other people are going to treat you well if you treat them well. And yet she sort of assumed that with the cat. It's like she anthropomorphized the cat as a human being, that, it was like feeding some homeless guy and then the homeless guy kicking her, that it was like, this shouldn't be happening. That's not the way to behave.
I think so. And I think because she finds something really unpalatable about Otto's outlook, and we can obviously come to him because we haven't really quite maybe got to, what's desperation for him. But, she finds that so unpalatable. And I feel like she has a guttural sense that he needs to be more in touch with his feelings. He should be more empathetic to Charlie and things like that. But yet he was right here. I mean, he's so unempathetic about the cat. Later on, he's happy to kick it, to get rid of it, and he just dismisses it. He says it's like a snake, or there's just such a chilly indifference to this animal that prior to it biting Sophie, you might feel a little bit sorry for the kind of plight of it. But he's proved right in that instance, and that is quite a sore one for her as well, in terms of like maybe undermining her faith in her own judgment as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, he has a more, shall we say, cynical view of other people than what she does, and you can see at times she's sort of trying to rebel against that or critique that. As to whether the novel fully vindicates his point of view is another thing, really. I think that, probably the character Charlie Russell is put in the novel to highlight Otto's weaknesses. But again, in this novel, you don't get a sense that any character absolutely nails the other and that one is right and the other one's wrong. I think each of them has something insightful to say about each other.
Definitely. Yeah, again, it's the really deep and nuanced realism of it there, because I mean with Otto, just in terms of him, I mean there was a quote I quite liked, which was from Sophie, where she sees him sleeping, and the quote is, even in his sleep he looked reasonable, although the immoderately twisted bedclothes suggested that reason and sleep had to be obtained at a cost. And I thought, that really captures him, that he's so determined to impose this ordering on, his house and how the street should be and how people should be, that he's hyper attached to that rigid ordering, but it's very precarious, of course. And he almost is more troubled when their holiday home in, is it Flinders, is vandalized. He's absolutely devastated and brought really to a state of real crisis by that, because he's so attached, I suppose, to this rationality.
Well, he is, and that notion of the law and how much it can be upheld is something that haunts him, because it's really the question of how much order can you bring to society. Really, how much can you sustain and uphold it? That is a key question. It's not only about the law, it's also about how he and other human beings can possibly uphold law and order when they've got these contrary tendencies. As it says in the novel, that this reason was achieved, was something that was achieved at a cost.
Yes.
And maybe you could say that about civilization in general. She might be making a wider point, the narrator. Even if Otto is a particularly severe, maybe almost semi-pathological case of that. When you hear about his father, that his father always expected people to tell stories and stick to the point. He didn't want digression.
Yes.
You can see how, if you're brought up by someone like that you would become very rational and ordered and focused, and downplaying the emotional side of life, which is obviously going to be richer but messier as well.
That's a great point. I mean, again, another brilliantly subtle detail inserted about the parent psychology to help understand these characters. Yeah, because as you say, it's like it's made Otto so orderly that he can't really quite do human relationships very well at all. You know, like his reason for splitting with Charlie is he sees him as melodramatic. You know, we get that. You see that with Charlie when we kind of meet him, is adamant 1 minute about one thing and then another, and it just is so much against the grain of Otto that even though it was like a long-term best friend, he's now decided he doesn't like him, and relationships are just too difficult for him, really.
Yeah, I mean, he might have that propensity to see it, pragmatically, how much it serves his current interests and goals. I think also, to be fair to him, he does explain to Sophie that he thinks Charlie may have been turning certain clients against him. I mean, he doesn't have absolute proof of that, but if that was the case, then that is certainly not good behavior, from your business partner. And this is, again, why it's complex, and that, nobody becomes a villain. I mean, I think we can see why, Charlie Russell would view Otto as somebody unreachable in a way, that he can't quite, break down those barriers and be recognized truly as a friend, as he would understand it, and probably as most people understand it. But we can also understand that, Otto's view about Charlie being histrionic in some ways too. I think both of them have, insightful points about each other.
I think that's almost the thing that's most consistent across the novel, as you say, is the way that they can all have even Otto can have a kind of savvy about the others. Obviously, as you said, relationships are difficult for him, but yeah, it's like, he sees Charlie, I thought it was interesting, in quite a cynical way. He sees him as almost a real phony who's kind of attached more to the image of being the kind of lawyer that helps the disadvantaged, rather than having a kind of sincere. And I think there's a truth to that, but that might be taken it a little bit too far, because I don't know about you, when we meet Charlie, as you said, I think histrionic's quite a good word. We on the one hand, he lets slip, he's got the lawyer in the Dickens novel Bleak House is kind of like his hero, and he tells an anecdote about when this lawyer made a witty little retort, and he loves this. So there's obviously is something about image that he's attached to. But
Yeah, sorry, on you go.
No, but yeah, I don't think he's an absolute phony or anything like that. I think there is still probably something genuine about what he values, like his politics and what he thinks the law firm should be.
I think one of the things that's very realistic about this is that, in real life, when people have insight into others, the insight could also be somewhat distorted by the person's own biases as well. So I mean, what Otto says about Charlie, what Charlie says about Otto, has a certain veracity, but it's also somewhat heightened by their own psychological quirks and insecurities and neuroses. At least that's how I saw it. And that's quite realistic.
I think that's spot on. Yeah, two little quotes, actually, just to give you. One of them, I thought, so from Charlie, he says, "I care about everything in my desperate fashion. It's desperation that keeps me going." And obviously, his final words in the book are through the phone, as it's kind of dangling from the receiver, saying, "I'm desperate, I'm desperate."
And I think also that, because Sophie and Otto are dealing with or suppressing at times their own sense of desperation, that they don't have the greatest sympathy for Charlie, who actually wears that desperation on his metaphorical sleeve more. I don't think Otto would care much for that, really.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. And maybe just a kind of, we could give Paula Fox herself the kind of closing word on this issue, because there was a really nice quote from an interview I was reading with her, which was from 2007. So I think she was in her 80s, and she was talking about this novel, and she said, to get at the truth of something, you really have to think about it. You have to think and feel about it. And somehow, whatever that process is, thinking and feeling, you have to lend yourself to it so that you can see it from every angle. And this really comes across, in terms of, as you've just been describing, the way the characters partly have wisdom in each other, partly misconstrue each other. It's a very complex kind of picture that we never really get a definitive reading from.
Well, that's right, and I think that we have to form that ourselves, based on these different perspectives, as we've been doing, trying to sift what actually is insightful from what has maybe been distorted by the characters. Of course, we're going to do it in light of our own biases and insecurities and so on. So, I mean, this is a complex process. That quote from the interview is interesting because it does highlight a sort of ethic of Paula Fox. And maybe this is what she expresses it through the character Sophie, because one of the Sophie's regular critiques at Otto is that he's so definite about things. It's so final.
Yes, indeed.
And I think, Sophie has a degree of contempt for that. Maybe this is something that Paula Fox as well was critiquing, about people that are so definite, so final in their pronouncements, that haven't undergone that process of looking at things from many different angles. And I think one of the things that struck me about this novel is that the insights that the characters have into each other are like shards of glass. They're acute and they're also quite bleak. Really, it's not. You don't get a sense at all, or I didn't anyway, throughout the whole novel that people are really seeing into each other and also seeing good.
Actually, that maybe leads us in nicely to a different question, which follows on that issue about the relationship, because so the question was, obviously, as the novel progresses, that the relationship Sophie and Otto has undergoes considerable strain. You've touched before on the fact of Sophie having had an affair. So based on what you've just said and what the novel kind of depicts, how do you see this relationship as ultimately disintegrating, or do you think there is still a future for them as a couple?
Well, I mean, there is obviously the possibility that it doesn't disintegrate, but they don't really have a viable future, if you see what I mean.
True, yeah.
I mean, really, it's quite speculative how it would turn out. But I mean, that affair and how it was conducted and how it came to an end, it was so anticlimactic.
Yeah.
How it came to an end, but it still has this sort of significance in her ruminations. But there doesn't seem to be any desire from either of them to leave the relationship, or things would become so unbearable that they would have to part. I mean, you see some worrying tendencies, such as Sophie feel contemptuous towards Otto, like that.
Yes.
It so suddenly comes to the fore, suggesting it's there as a kind of background for her. But yeah, I didn't get any. I have no idea how that relationship would develop, disintegrate, or stay together. I think they would definitely have trouble finding meaning together in their lives. I think it doesn't look promising in that regard. But I didn't get a sense that it was forming any tea leaves that I could read with any insight.
No, indeed. I mean, this is part of the genius of the novel. I would take the same view. I mean, there's moments of hate and frustration, but I would say they never seem to lose some element of love for each other, which obviously vacillates. Obviously, the novel is this dramatic weekend. It's over quite a short period of time, and there is the suggestion that turbulent times are something they have endured. Obviously, the affair was interesting as well, because I mean, the guy she was having the affair with, I can't remember his name, Francis maybe, or something.
Francis Early, yeah.
That's it. Yeah, he goes back to his wife and children, and she gets a sense that she was a bit much for him, and he doesn't really quite share her passionate nature. So again, that would be quite a disillusioning experience for her. And it's not clear really that she's even looking for something else of that kind, if she's more resigned to the situation with Otto, or she thinks maybe she can get a bit more out of Otto. It's all very unclear. Yeah, you're right. It's hard to know.
I mean, the thing is that she probably was left with a sense of being used, really, there in a way. But yeah, what exactly transpired between her and Francis is very difficult to work out. I mean, this was a guy that was a publisher of horticultural books and books
Yeah.
about beetles. In other words, classifying things in a very clear way. And yet we can't really do that with this affair. It's hard to say exactly what kind of butterfly this affair was. You know what I mean?
Mhm. It's
It's
true.
very hard to nail down what actually was going on. How much was he still in love with his wife? How much did he go back out of a certain convention, or just weariness, really there. Clearly was drawn to Sophie, in terms of lust. In terms of personality, they didn't really say too much to each other. And it seemed as though he was quite abstracted even in their most intimate moments.
You're right. I mean, it's hard actually, based on Paula Fox's very concise way of writing. It's hard to really see what quite generated the level of passion that seemed to come over Sophie. And I kind of got the impression, in a way, it was there, looking for an object, and he temporarily. She maybe read a certain level of passion and it turned out not to be there, and she eventually kind of saw through that. I don't know if that's right,
Yeah.
though. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, for me, one of the most significant things that she said about him is that, she was quite taken by how solicitous he was, how much he was actually attending to them when they visited.
Yes.
Like she said, like an over solicitous child. Clearly, there was a kind of politeness in that, but that attentiveness, even if it was somewhat out of politeness and maybe not entirely heartfelt, is quite a contrast to Otto, actually, because he can never be accused of being attentive in a sustained way. I mean, we see that over the course of the novel, that as the novel goes on, he does become more concerned about the bite, but he takes his time for it to kick in, doesn't it? Really, and he doesn't really have quite a sustained concern, and accepted moments like they're at the hospital and so on. But
it's so ambiguous. I mean, even in the early scene, when she has just owned up to him, she's got this bite, and on the one hand, there's a little bit of concern from him about it, but he then pretty quickly gets immediately back on the issue of him and Charlie, and then I thought this was an interesting line. He says, "I'll be better off by myself," and he says that immediately after he's just explained to her why he thought she shouldn't have been petting the cat, in quite a sort of childlike way. So again, there was a bit of, I wondered, is that intimating a kind of Freudian slip element there, that he's actually, in general, seeing life would be a bit better by himself if he didn't have to put up with other people and their foibles. And is she kind of sort of dimly aware of that dimension to him, just a solo element that maybe has, as you said, this other man who is paying her a little bit more direct attentions maybe has, felt like there was a real appeal there, because she just doesn't get much of that from Otto. I don't know.
I mean, I think there is something in what you say, that she probably has this fear that if she doesn't want to burden him with any troubles that she has, she doesn't want to claim too much attention from him consciously, but then unconsciously there will be that unrecognized need for love, for affection that isn't getting met, really. And that this Francis Early, who was somewhat stereotyped in his attentiveness and affection, is still something that elicits that in her, really, because maybe she's, as you say, she's looking for anything that is remotely what she needs, and he happened to be something that was remotely close to what she needed, but obviously not actually a good fit, as we can see from the way that the relationship devolved, really.
Indeed. I mean, it's so difficult because, I mean, this is the thing. On the one hand, you sometimes have Otto in a kind of slightly condescending parent role, but there's, the moment where the house has been trashed and he's, he kind of comes out with this sort of almost existential cry, like how am I to live? When he's, obviously this has just been violated, their holiday home, and there's no, it doesn't seem like the local policeman's really going to be able to do much about it, and so on. So, and Sophie's reaction was interesting at that point, because he was in quite a kind of childlike, vulnerable state, and she kind of laments the fact that I think, does he see her face? And her face is a little bit scathing at that moment, because she thinks this is all a bit silly. It's some vandalism. What's the big deal? So again, there is a kind of vulnerable child quality to him sometimes in how he reaches out, looking for that reassurance from her. So it's really dense and complex. And
yeah, well, I mean, I feel that while Francis Early maybe spoke to some unmet needs in her, I still get the impression that overall Otto cared more about her overall.
Yes.
But in this rather oblique sort of way, which, as you say, at times is sort of punctured when he reaches out to her in vulnerability, or he's trying desperately to convey something to her. And it's interesting for somebody that is so literary minded, and how she reads the world, that, when he says about the house being violated, and sees this sort of symbolic significance, almost like the guy looking after their house and the family, the way their house is arranged, it's like saying die to him and people like him, that she seems to somewhat dismiss it as a more literal thing, that it was just vandalized. And yeah, I didn't quite expect that from her, just to see it in that very matter-of-fact way.
Yeah, I mean, if I was to have a bet as to how it might pan out, I think for me, it's probably leaning more in the direction of they'll probably carry on as they are. I don't really see anything there, although it's been a crisis and it's really shaken their sense of security in many ways. I think it's more the absence of alternatives, really, and the fact that they're in this pattern and they still love each other, although they deeply frustrate each other. So yeah, that would be, to me, that's how I think she's just trying to show the real complexities of what a marriage could be like. I think that's probably what it is.
So. And when Otto says that he can't start another career as a lawyer in Chicago, because of his age, I think that will be a key consideration in their relationship as well, that because they're a middle-aged couple, that they'll probably continue on as they are in many ways, and they're used to adapting to adverse circumstances to some extent. How they got used to adapted to not having any children. Now, it's not intimated that they really wanted children, but there's that sense anyway. They got used to it, whatever significance that had for them. They came to terms with it in some shape or form, and that's what they'll probably do, even if it becomes difficult at times to do that without quite some distress or desperation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose this is exactly the desperation of the situation. As we've discussed before, Sophie is not predominantly an active person. I don't know what the word is, slight stupor, slight periods of kind of malaise, and with obviously the passion has come out at points, and then Otto, obviously, although he's been shaken by what's happened, I think in both cases there's nothing really in their characters to me that's going to suggest any kind of radical split or change. I mean, this is obviously part of the dynamic that they'll be so habituated to, after their 15 years together.
When I consider the kind of desperation that they feel, I mean, there's almost this sense in the novel that desperation or despair in some way can become routine, really, something that is part of the background almost of your life until it jumps to the foreground at points. But, something that they're living with, that is part of their life, part of the fabric of their life.
I think that's a good point. I mean, that another question we were going to consider which I think relates to that, really, is about this sense of living in a kind of vulnerable, almost under siege kind of state, because obviously they, it's not just them, other members of their kind of social set, I think it's the Holsteins, they go and somebody throws a rock through the window, and there's a kind of background of potential hostility there, and as you said, there's both the kind of the internal dynamics where things can feel desperate, but as you described really early on about the kind of economic context as well. And it's suggested when their Flinders home is trashed, this has actually been happening to other affluent city dwellers, holiday homes. So there is a kind of broader sense really of this kind of vulnerability. And yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that is just because, I mean, the other relationships we see in the novel as well aren't straightforward. Our friend Claire and her first husband, who seems to be coming back to her for a kind of greater comradeship or all these things. It's all very complicated. So yeah, I think you're right. There is a kind of background of that desperation. In terms of the specific question I wanted to ask about that, this sort of sense of these middle class couples being under siege, did you see that as just the socioeconomic conditions of the time, New York, or do you think that is kind of about particular kind of individual neurosis, paranoid kind of mindsets, or what or the more psychological side? Do you think it's more of a kind of economic siege, or what's your kind of take?
I mean, I'd be tempted to say both to some extent, in that, clearly where the Bentwoods are living, there's also slums just, directly across the street. So that, combination of affluence and also poverty, and the way, of course, poverty is portrayed in the novel, how much that's Paula Fox's perspective and how much it's the Bentwoods is something we could talk about later. But I'm also tempted to say it might have more to, this sense of being under siege might have more to do with the characters, and that we see with Charlie Russell that he is someone that is moving with the times, in that he's aware of the current social issues to engage with, and he wants to engage with that. Quite why, in terms of motivations, is quite, is complex. Otto reads it in quite a cynical way, and I don't think he's without a point, but I don't think that quite captures it. But that's another issue. But Otto is someone that doesn't want to work with the times. He is someone that he kind of sees civilization as, he probably sees himself as being very civilized, and he is what a civilized person should be, and it's quite a static conception. And so, when there is changes, he feels threatened by any changes, I think, and that's a sense of being under siege that is to do with his own insecurities. I think also a very telling thing was that when a police officer came, a few years before and said to Otto, at his doorstep, that people like the Bentwoods were basically making the area more civilized, a better place to live. That, the very telling line is that, Otto felt a murderous gratification at that. Now, the thing is, the murderous gratification, I think that reveals that he wants to eradicate in some way these people, these signs of decay as he sees it, the sort of rabid elements of society. He thinks that anything that can't be quite neatly put into ordered compartments is rabid and needs to be murdered, destroyed. And so if that's your view, I don't want to sound like Jordan Peterson here about order and chaos, but I'm sure he could go to town on this novel. But if you've got that conception of order, an order that isn't dynamic, that isn't keeping in touch with change, then you're going to feel very much under siege by changes, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a sort of diabolical contrast in a way, which obviously is very effective, dramatically, because Otto is, the way kind of early on, I think it uses the phrase antique serenity of his house, and in terms of how he sees it and the joy it brings him. And yeah, there is a view that anybody who's not trying to preserve the kind of classical look, is basically failing as a person and is somebody he would look down on. And so obviously, the people round about in these slum areas, he has no sympathy for them, as you said. He sees them really as like a scourge, and he would, I mean, it's almost implying he would like to just completely rid society of poorer people. So I mean, there is, I should say, I mean, that is a pretty extreme outlook for somebody to have, who clearly is surrounded by people who are going to, resent him partly for his wealth and clearly continue to offend his supposed sense of decency and so on. So, yeah, I mean, it's a bit It's a recipe for disaster, that one, really.
Well, it is, and there's that sort of neurotic rationality that he has. One that doesn't engage too much with feelings because his own emotions. I'm not saying that he doesn't reflect at all upon them. That would be too severe a criticism. But it's almost like the emotional side of life is like the debris on the street. The mess.
Yeah.
And that he would rather get rid of that, and things could then be rather straightforward. I'm not going to say he's like Spock from Star Trek quite. It's not as obvious as that. But I think, to be fair, the idea of emotions being messy, I mean, it's a phrase that people often use, isn't it? And also they make us vulnerable, and we don't really know what will emerge when we engage with them. So if you're somebody that wants to stick to a very ordered way of looking at the world, engaging with your own emotional responses isn't quite the greatest way of doing that.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think also that we could. I mean, I know this might sound like an unusual link, but I think it applies that, if Alan Watts was able to meet up with Otto, I think he'd be saying to Otto that you actually need to embrace the insecurity of life, the fact that it isn't fully ordered, that it's dynamic and changing, and that way you would feel more secure and less under siege. Whereas if you're more wanting to stay in the past, if you're more about, or you're too much about conservation and order, you're going to feel under siege by how things are changing. And that isn't necessarily always decay and destruction. That's what change means for Otto. And obviously, as he looks out and he sees these slum areas, that verifies in his mind the idea that change is disorder and decay.
I think that's absolutely spot on. The Alan Watts link, I think that is there because I think in Otto it's like, I mean, obviously the Alan Watts paradox is that the more you try to seek security, the more insecure you feel, and you need to embrace that insecurity. And I mean, in Otto, it's kind of comic, really. There was the detail that one summer at Flinders, 3 gay men from New York came out and rented a barn and made lots of noise playing loud music. So Otto's response was he bought the barn, just so they couldn't do, that kind of level of need to control and not have offending, that is a really pretty extreme kind of neurotic perspective, in terms of, as you say, the order and the control, so it's obviously going to create somebody who's going to feel on some level deeply at threat of insecurity, and I mean
that's a good point about the gay men and playing Judy Garland and the farmhouse, and how I think what was really telling is how much he saw it as a personal assault on him. And this is the thing that, I mean, he could look out at that slum area and feel pity and want to get involved in political causes that could help those people. But of course, that would be like Charlie Russell, apparently. Yes. But he actually sees, and I mean, this isn't, uncommon with human beings, just to see something else as almost like a symbol of, or a confirmation of your view, which actually can end up dehumanizing the people, because he just thinks that the people across the road are indicative of decay and disorder. Yes. And so he doesn't really see it as an anthropologist, as Jules Henry say would, that would try and empathically understand, well, how is it to live there, and what are their needs, and how is the world from their side of the street? Of course, he has no interest in that at all. Instead he sees them, he dehumanizes them through symbolism. And I think this is maybe one of the underlying themes of the novel, is the danger of symbolizing things and actually creating more alienation by doing so.
I wouldn't say that the novel was terribly empathetic, just more generally in the way it depicts people, from these kind of poorer areas. And
No,
I mean,
no.
there was that was a question I wondered about. Is there something a little bit kind of misanthropic about the perspective that Paula Fox has here? I'm not sure of the answer to that, but I just kind of wondered about that one, really, in terms of just quite how really it is quite grotesque the way that these characters are kind of, there's not really any sense of there having any kind of voice, or I mean, there's obviously a degree of sympathy from Sophie, but I don't know. Do you think is it a kind of misanthropic depiction, or is that maybe taking it too far?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the novel was written now that and it was to be published, that there would be the expectation that the black characters in the novel would be, or some of them would be more humanized rather than being symbols of this sort of decay that's going around them as far as Otto sees it. Anyway, I remember reading a book about humor, and there was a chapter about slapstick and the more sort of physical based humor, and how that would often be connected with people of lower status.
Okay.
And it's one of the reasons the author was saying that if a gentleman with a top hat slips on a banana peel, it's funny because he's been reduced to the physical, which we don't usually assume, with people with higher status.
Yes.
And so there is almost a sort of grotesque slapstick at times, like say with the black man with the green, paper plane in his hand and his buttocks showing out and falling about, and he seems to be drunk. And and so, it's like, this grotesque physicality that is being portrayed, which is, dehumanizing if we thought, well, that isn't how all black characters are. And then also we don't actually know about this particular black character. Maybe he's ill or something, or maybe he's in great distress and that's why he's behaving in this way. I mean, I think this is something that Sophie maybe raises.
To be fair, she does.
And I think that, if Paula Fox had been misanthropic, she probably wouldn't have put that kind of line in, to be honest.
That's true.
Really. So I think, that's a reminder that we don't necessarily have to look at that scene in that way, actually, even if someone like Otto would be very keen to view it in that way. But yes, they're not the black characters, the poor characters in the novel are not given much of a voice. Apart from that time the black guy comes to use their phone. But again, as we've said time and time again with this novel, the characters are never completely categorizable, because Otto does allow that guy to use the phone, so he's not so prejudiced or frightened that he shuts the door on the guy. And he also gives him $50 as well, which is isn't just a very clear-cut generous thing, because he comes to regret it in some ways. And of course the significance of giving that money isn't quite clear, but it can't be read in a very straightforward, generous way.
No. I think so. I mean, I think like everything else about the novel, these elements are handled kind of in a nuanced, subtle way. I certainly don't think any kind of straightforward conclusion could be made about Paula Fox in that regard.
No, I didn't get the feeling that she herself was, expressing prejudice there. But also, I did feel an uneasiness by there wasn't really a character in the novel to highlight that contrast.
No.
I mean, we do have Sophie reminding Otto and reminding the readers, if they needed to be reminded, that maybe the black guy with the green plane in his hand is actually distressed in some way, or that we mustn't just see him as Otto would see as being entirely irresponsible.
No. Yeah, it was difficult to know. I mean, quite kind of what to make of some of the way these kind of minor characters were depicted. Because I was thinking I think he's maybe meant to be Hispanic. There's the guy who ultimately Sophie sees him through the window in the early hours, and he's not wearing any trousers, so and he kind of moves his hands to expose himself, you know. But you know that same character, he features a little bit earlier because he has a baby that's cried night and he gets up and again he's not wearing any, he obviously sleeps with no trousers on, so it's, you know, it describes him as just standing looking at the baby and the baby's crying and he's not really sure quite what to do, but then later after he's just exposed himself, you know, Sophie looks back around again, he's then kind of cuddling the baby, so it's you know, it's difficult to know quite what to make of that really. And as you say, that these characters don't really get a chance to articulate themselves, so it's all just a kind of slightly bizarre, slightly grotesque background to the main to the action.
Yeah, I mean, definitely they are portrayed as the other in the novel, and I mean that would make sense in as far as the Bentwoods would see them as other, but they were probably other to some extent to Paula Fox, perhaps. You know, I mean, I don't want to be too categorical about that because I don't really know for sure, but you get the feeling that there is that element there, you know, that there's not a direct acquaintanceship
I would,
there, and that they are kind of observed from a distance.
yeah, I mean, it would seem, and I mean, I don't know enough about Paula Fox's background either. I mean, I think it, you know, it was a fairly literary kind of family. So yeah, I mean, it's likely she was writing from the perspective, I guess, that was more familiar to her, which would be the more kind of middle class, predominantly white, you know, kind of families that she was kind of familiar with socially, I would assume. I mean, I don't know for sure on that one. That would be difficult to say, but that there's a slight vibe of that would seem to be coming across in the novel. I think that's probably right.
Well, I mean, you know, the author L.J. Davis will probably cover one of his, but you know, A Meaningful Life at some point. But you know, I think he, you know, in the 70s, lived in that area where Paula Fox lived, or certainly they were acquaintances, and she did wrote a review about his book A Meaningful Life. But you know, I can remember reading that he had adopted a black child in that era. And that had been quite an isolating thing to do in that era because of the racism of that time. So I mean, this is not what a white family would have done in that era. Of course, I think Different Strokes highlights that as well, does it? And L.J. Davis doing that was obviously a very noble thing to do, but not a common thing to do. And certainly the Bentwoods would never be doing that. No. I'm not. I think, you know, I did get the sense that she was being misanthropic. I didn't get the sense that she was being overtly racist or anything like that. But maybe just that you know, certain groups would be observed from a distance, really, and in quite a detached way. I think part of the problem that we're having here is that, you know, Paula Fox and you know, we'll have to come to our own evaluation about what this means, you know, what we think of this. Sure. But, you know, Paula Fox is a very detached writer in general, you know. There is you would never have guessed, unless you read it, that this was also a children's author, you know. Not just because of the sophistication, you know, of the writing, you know, not to say that, you know, children's authors can't be very, very intelligent, but I'm just meaning, you know, a very different sort of genre of writing, and just that, yeah, there isn't a warmth there. It's not it's a very watchful, acutely intelligent perspective, and I say acutely because, as I say, it's like shards of glass, and so, you know, brilliantly written, but there is this. I felt anyway there was a certain chilliness in some ways, you know, mean, it's not as though what she was writing about was an upbeat scenario.
No.
It did seem there was a certain, it was very literary and quite clinical at the same time, which is fascinating juxtaposition.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, that's a great point though about her. I mean, I think she primarily, or certainly she wrote a lot more children's novels than she did adult novels. But yeah, I mean, I'm not saying she's similar in style, but I mean, in terms of the kind of writerly eye, she was a little bit reminded me of Pinter in terms of just quite how dark, but also psychologically astute and not very warm. This kind of depiction was. It's a bit like she, not a similar writer to Pinter, but in terms of just spirit to some degree. There was a kind of dark, slightly. Forensic,
I mean, I'm not saying that sensibility is one that I find uncongenial.
Oh no, not at all.
Or anything, because obviously you know how it is with Pinter, that and he's like that too. But I think that because it is detached in many ways, it's hard to work out if she was more detached when it came to Black people and Hispanic people, if you see what I mean.
Yes, that's
it's
right.
not easy to work out because the tone is generally detached.
You're quite right. It's not
but
easy
it is. I mean, I think you're right that Pinter and her do generally expect people to be quite neurotic and pathological in many ways. And it gets me thinking about, and I don't know if I'm quite pronouncing her name correctly, but the lady that wrote these brilliant aphorisms, Mignon McLaughlin, that she said that human beings were like birds, that from a distance that they were all beautiful on the wing, and then up close you would see their beady eyes. And I think there's that sensibility there with Paula Fox, that it's a very close rendering of how people are behaving, and you see the beady eyes. They're not saying all the time, but there's a lot of that going on.
Well, indeed. I mean, I wondered because, obviously, the final question we're going to talk about really is about the kind of, literary qualities of this, what I think is an excellent novel. But one alternative way of phrasing that, I wondered, was, obviously her novels very quickly went out of print. They were quite critically regarded, but they clearly, something about them wasn't making them beloved, and they've been revived ultimately, particularly by Jonathan Franzen, and kind of pushing for Paula Fox's talent, which is there. But I wonder if something about that slightly forensic, slightly detached tone really made her a bit unpalatable, actually, for a period of time.
Well, I was thinking that myself. I have to say that they've been revived, but with badly they've been badly reprinted, which is almost like, are they unsure whether they want us to read it or not? But this is not an endearing writer. I mean, the thing is that Pinter, Paula Fox, Caroline Blackwood, these people are not intended to be endearing in how they portray people. But again, they probably think that they're adhering to a very clean and honest realism.
Well, I mean, Franzen, who I've mentioned a few times, I mean, he, contemporary author, describes this as the greatest realist novel of the post-war era. He's unequivocal about this particular novel of Paula Fox as being, absolutely iconic. I guess because it really captures something of New York, particularly at that time, but there's so much more to it. And I think you could make a good case for that. I don't know. I haven't read enough of these kind of genre novels to make that judgment.
It's possible. I
mean, it is a very good novel. There's no doubt.
It is. But it's not a feel. If we're putting it in very straightforward, basic terms, it's not a feel good.
No.
And I remember one critic said that Pinter had created the feel bad play, and I think that this is obviously a novel that is intended to get us to examine our way of living. Particularly if our way of living was close to the Bentwoods. So there's a lot of it's got this intense scrutiny to it.
Yeah.
And how many people have the stomach for that? I mean, also, how many people reading it would find it, shall we say, comprehensible, enough. I mean, I'm not saying that it would go completely over most New Yorkers' heads, but again, the percentage of people that it would resonate with them, and that they maybe would get some deeper comprehension, would be probably quite small. I think, it's not a popular novel.
It's definitely not. I mean, I think the feel bad labels pretty spot on here, because I think the thing is, it's not there's not really a lot offered here that's a kind of, I think you could, I mean, if you dig really deep, maybe you could get into what would be a more positive alternative to what she's depicting here. But really, I mean, it's like it's both highlighting the terrible grimness of those who are living in the slum areas and how miserable that is, but it's also a pretty grim life of those who are living, the kind of affluent, more kind of American dream supposed lifestyle, actually. So it's quite subversive in that way, because obviously, their situation of privilege makes them vulnerable. And also, as we described, somebody like Otto, neuroses about, say, seeking security and so on are likely to be exacerbated by that vulnerability and that wealth inequality. So it's kind of, it's not like there's really anybody who's living a really enviable life in that novel.
No, and I mean, we know ourselves that when you look at people's lives in general up close, that they're rarely enviable. I mean, I'm sure there's one or two out there, but I mean, there is quite a lot of suffering and distress and difficulty in human life. And so I think that, for me, a realistic novel, of various characters would, if it was making out that they had very enviable lives, that would really seem that realistic to me.
No, I mean, indeed. I mean, and again, it's like, it's just slightly reminded me as well about the sort of film noir genre again, kind of cultish movies that have varied in their popular appeal, in some cases really have been revived and so on. And again, it's the same story, really, isn't it? It's well, I mean, it's both specifically a critique of kind of the American dream notion, but also just showing people in dilemmas, people who are struggling and suffering, and it's realism, but it's quite difficult to swallow, particularly maybe if it's not always what people look for when they go to buy a novel, obviously.
Well, no, I mean I mean, in psychology they talk about this idea of depressive realism.
Okay,
which is this notion that in some regards people with depression are more realistic about certain situations, and you get the sense that this is almost a work in the genre depressive realism, and that there's no real solution offered, but there's a very acute rendering of the symptoms and maybe an intimation of what the underlying disease is to some extent, but no idea of a cure or antidote anytime soon.
No, you're right. I mean, it's funny. I mean, when I was thinking about that issue, you obviously mentioned Alan Watts earlier, and it reminded me of what an Alan Watts might say if he encountered, as you said, like an Otto. But I mean that, if you've not read Alan Watts alongside this, you're not really getting an awful lot in terms of something kind of constructive you can take from this, really, about the good life. It's just really, as you say, it's really getting into the nitty gritty of kind of ennui and existential angst and breakdowns in communication, all these things that lead to lots of kind of suffering that wealth can't really solve. It's certainly
no, it can't, and obviously wealth can exacerbate it in the terms of that sort of sterile rationality that Otto has as part of is symptomatic to some extent of his wealth and education. So I mean, it's that kind of thing that civilizing influences, shall we say, could also lead to a certain sterility. And I think that's the thing, that like if you're seeing it in a Freudian way, how do we get that balance between the id and our conscience, our superego? Because if we see life as that this notion that you've either got this sort of sterile rationality or you're rabid, then you're not going to be able to integrate your feelings and your thoughts with any kind of aliveness, because the aliveness comes mainly from your feelings. But if you see it as being like the potentially rabid stray cat
Yep.
that you've disowned and that now it's come back, the return of the repressed, then you're not going to really feel alive. You're going to be shut off in this sort of sterile will to order. So I think it's like we've got to be very careful about how we define certain things. That we mustn't discredit our feelings as simply something messy and rabid as Otto and maybe Sophie to some extent as well.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that because to me, obviously, as you said, this is it's, for various reasons, this is going to be quite maybe a tricky novel. Some people would maybe be struggling a little bit with it just because it's quite complex, and of course it's not very upbeat, but there is something in these, as you said, these kind of depictions of the malady. When you look really closely at them, you can see there's real wisdom to be found there, actually, because as you say, this is different species of really, a bit like with Pinter, really neurotic living that we're not compelled to live in that way, and we can have more awareness about them. So there is actually tremendous value in somebody who's willing to go there, I suppose, into the kind of maybe depressive realism stuff, because they can actually highlight how bad it can get, or some of the pitfalls, but we can still kind of think about that and not just simply be depressed by it. We can do
well.
Do
no.
I mean,
I'm not saying that this is a novel that inevitably makes someone depressed. I don't mean it in that way, but I think that it could potentially be seen as downbeat. Which not necessarily. I mean, again, it's not going to be a very prescriptive novel about ways to overcome those things, but in a subtle way, it can suggest how people exacerbate that alienation or estrangement from their feelings and from each other. There's something that we can learn from this story in that way.
Well, I mean, because there was the interesting line, wasn't there, right towards the end, where Sophie, I think she's something about, she's about to put some kind of really expensive face cream on, and she's reflecting about what's happened with the cat, and she says she has a moment of extreme relief, and it's something about, she says, "God, if I'm rabid, I'm equal to what's out there," or something like that.
Yes, that's right.
And I thought, that's an interesting little kind of subtle hint at what's the way out of this dilemma, because there is something in the sort of maybe moment of self-awareness there, or just almost kind of overcoming the me and the other dimension to maybe the way she might think ordinarily in that moment.
Well, I mean, I can see why somebody might read it that way. I kind of saw that line as very telling as well, but more a sort of indication of the distortion in their perspectives, which is, to see the outside world as simply rabid was a kind of, distorted characterization of that world, as though, and that was part of the problem, because if you see the outside world as rabid, and you're not, say, then, that's why you can feel that you've got to maintain this spurious order, and feel under siege. On the other hand, if she was rabid, it's like this idea, well, maybe I could, rejoin that world in some ways.
I mean, that was the thought I kind of had. I mean, but I mean, it's a little bit oblique, and I'm not sure really, again, like most of the things in this novel, it's quite hard to be too definitive about quite what the meaning is. But
it's as I say, I think the characters are caught in this dichotomy between too much order or seeing things as rabid, and they're imprisoned within that, and they don't really have a way of reconciling, the sort of alive chaos with the sort of potentially deadening order, really.
Particularly given the economic context, because, in a way, some of their, say, security fears are realistic, right? Because I mean, obviously, if they're going to live in that neighborhood and they're going to have a
Yeah.
very, gentrified house and so on, then that is somewhat vulnerable. And obviously, as she goes to see her friend Claire, doesn't she, who's living in
Yeah.
I think I can't remember what area it is, but I think the suggestion is it's more directly dangerous, the streets round about where she's living and so on. And yeah, I mean, there is a kind of unavoidable insecurity there, and but it's not that things are rabid. That's obviously taking it too far. So it's that difficulty, really, isn't it?
No,
Getting
I mean, it
balanced.
is. Yeah, I mean, there is that, there's something that Otto and Sophie don't quite appreciate, which is there's different kinds of order, and and the order outside their world may not be rabid and chaotic. But they seem to think it is, just because it's it's a world that they're not acquainted with, and it seems very different to their world, so they think it's chaotic, that it's rabid, when it may not be. Really,
I think that's it. I mean, obviously, Sophie, she's distraught by the vandalism of their Flinders home, but not to the same degree, because it's like she's a little bit closer to that understanding, I suppose, of maybe the mentality of maybe some teenagers who whatever it might be. And yeah, obviously with her kind of, our thinking maybe I am rabid, there's a kind of strange potential momentary consolation in that thought. But yeah, certainly Otto's very, very far away from being able to bridge that gap, even in a not terribly realistic way, and I mean it's very much othered, from where he's.
I mean, it's like kind of trying to integrate that order and chaos, shall we say, in a way that keeps a dynamic growth going, rather than, in the case of Otto, sticking to this preservation of the past. But and anything that is different is seen as rabid, is seen as chaotic, is seen as destruction, a sort of devolution.
Yeah, that's right. Indeed, yeah. It's the neurosis of absolutes, really, isn't it? I suppose
I think so. There, I mean, and that maybe what is for Sophie this insight. If she's rabid, then it should be like the world outside. Maybe that moment of illumination for her is also a revelation of the distortion of the perspective to us, if you see what I mean.
I'm wondering what you made of the final scene of the novel, Alec. Obviously, we have Otto hurling the inkwell that Sophie's been using to write to her mum against the wall, and we're kind of left with the two of them standing, looking at the ink dripping down, as we hear Charlie's voice coming through the phone saying that he's desperate. How did you read that final scene?
I mean, this is him at his angriest in a way, like that. I mean, for most people, throwing an ink bottle at a wall isn't, that bad, but for someone that is so controlled,
yes,
and inhibited, that is obviously quite a change, a shift for him. And
absolutely.
It's a sign, I think it's a sign of his exasperation, his desperation. And the way I read it was that he doesn't really know how to engage with Charlie at that point. He was reaching out in this very, desperate, pleading way.
Yes.
And yet he doesn't really know how to deal with that, what really to do. And I thought the characters are so alienated, him and Charlie are so estranged from each other in a way.
And again, I thought it was just brilliantly subtle and ambiguous, that I think when he does that, initially, Sophie, I think, does she put her arm around him or something? And,
yes,
as if suggesting, in a way, that's all that could be like she's seen that as a bit of a breakthrough. He's actually, expressed emotion, and he's in touch with a bit of anger. But then they kind of separate a little again, or they just stand beside each other and they just look at the ink dripping down. So again, even there, as you said, I mean, you can't really have any definite reading of any of it. I think there was a good quote in the introduction by Jonathan Franz, and he said something about the sentences being like tiny novels in themselves. You know, this
Yes,
he calls it like small miracles of compression. You know, and it is a bit like that. You know, you could really zoom in on any particular little part of it, and it can suddenly seem more and more complex. You know, it really is quite
well,
something.
yes, yeah. I mean, it's very compressed, and because of that, you know, you get this sense of heightened significance, but you know, even within so many lines,
Yeah.
there. But yes, clearly, Otto came to some kind of crisis point for him. You know, I mean, his crisis, the way it would be expressed, would be rather understated. You know, like throwing
Yes.
an ink bottle against the wall. But still, it shows that he's lost the sense of how to respond. You know, a kind of coming to the end of his tether, but not in a very, very dramatic way. Again, this is connected to the sort of realism
Yeah.
of
But
the novel.
but again, quite a good moment in a sense for the curtain to drop, really, you know. But given what the novel is, you know, in terms of that, again, being kind of ambiguous, being a kind of moment of drama, but as you said, I mean, not that dramatic as far as it could go. So unclear
No,
what that'll, you know. Again, it's so unresolved at that point, really. You know,
well,
what
it is. Yeah, I mean, Sophie going over to support him, you know, put her arm around him, is a sign of a connection. But as you say, it's then quickly withdrawn with them both
Yes.
looking. And yeah, I mean, there's them looking at the ink flowing down the wall and that sort of bewilderment. It's sort of like how they feel about their predicament overall. You know that they're witnessing it as much as experiencing it, and are somewhat bewildered by it.
That's a very good point. That's exactly it. Yeah, that kind of pause to just stare at it and not quite know what to do. I mean, that is you're quite right. That really is what they're doing throughout the novel in a way. They're
I
not
think
sure how
so
to
in
act.
many ways, and then you've got the little voice of Charlie Russell coming through the
Yeah.
telephone. I mean, because you know, you could imagine two people that could have dealt with that estrangement in a way that heals the relationship to some extent.
Yes.
But Otto and Charlie being so different, it makes you wonder actually how they became business partners to begin with.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, that's right.
and but you know, Otto just has no. Again, it's maybe the sense of being besieged by things, you know, in that he's being besieged by Charlie, you know, by this incessant phone calls.
Well,
And
I mean, it was interesting because I mean, the way that I think Sophie at one point, I can't remember who she's describing it to, but it's the idea that in the early days, he saw Charlie
mm,
as opposite but admirable. You know, he had almost like an envy
mm,
and he felt a bit insecure. But it's like as time's gone on and he's felt more, self-assured in a
mm,
way, but certainly more attached to his own orderly way of doing things. It was
mm,
like it. I think she describes it as a shift, you know, to seeing Charlie as ultimately more histrionic rather than just enjoyably emotional. You know, there's a subtle shift in that he sees this difference as unpalatable suddenly, and that
mm,
would seem to fit with the narrowing of his perspective. I would have thought, you know, and a kind of a more and more attachment to the neurotic actually,
mm.
and him. So yeah, I don't know. That's
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, from what we can glean, you know, Charlie Russell is someone that there's a bit of a performativity about him. What we would say now, virtue signaling
mm,
to some extent,
yeah, yeah,
but there is also a sense of things are changing and that it's right to keep up with that.
yeah.
But you know, for Otto, you know, he sees that he just sees the histrionic and performative virtue signaling element of it. He doesn't seem to he can't grant any credence to the positive aspects of what Charlie Russell is doing, because that's about change, you know, wanting change or at least accepting change. You know,
Yeah.
Charlie Russell at least accepts that change. Otto is certainly working against it or refusing to see it
And
in some ways.
it's a good point as well, though, you make there, that you know that to some extent, you know, Otto has actually maybe seen through things in Charlie that he maybe initially maybe naively saw as
Mm,
being entirely good, and he's
mm,
seen some insincerity, and he's now kind of gone to the other extreme in a way. It's a bit like, again, this problem of this kind of absolute way that he categorizes the world, people in it, and so on. So Charlie's now flipped in a way.
Yeah, but I think, you know, if we look at the final scene, you've got someone that is struggling to adhere to how he sees Charlie, because probably he recognizes this guy's trying to reach out to him.
True.
But he also has this very definite and categorical stance on him. And I think he doesn't really know how to reconcile those two things, and he throws the ink bottle against the wall. You know, because he just has got this frustration. He doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't want to talk to him because he thinks, you know, to use a Holden Caulfield term, he thinks he's a phony. But another New Yorker. But also there probably is part of him that recognizes this as real vulnerability too. And he doesn't really know how to respond to it. So he acts in the way that he does.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is. It's funny actually. Obviously, we haven't. The fact that we'd covered Catcher in the Rye, not too long ago. Obviously, that's another kind of iconic. And there's New York anyway to a good extent in that novel. What if you were to actually just as a final issue to consider? What would be? Which of the two novels do you prefer? Say Catcher in the Rye versus Desperate Characters. Obviously, there's similarities and differences there. What's your
yeah, well, I mean, for me, I think I would go with Desperate Characters being. I mean, of course, the narrative voice is of this, highly intelligent, perceptive, viewer. Audience member almost watching their lives and chronicling it. And of course, Salinger is writing in the voice of a 14-year-old, I think, at the time. So obviously Holden isn't going to write with the same acuity of perception so when I say that I had the sense that Desperate Characters was better written in some ways, again, it might be a bit unfair because obviously it just wouldn't be realistic at all for a 40-year-old to have that kind of voice.
Of course,
But I would say overall that I felt more congenial to Catcher in the Rye.
Okay.
As a book. Because I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned Pinter earlier on, and both of them. Both Paula Fox and Pinter are very, they've got this very jaundiced eye. A very acute jaundiced eye. For me, when it comes to Pinter, that I don't really have much a problem with that. I didn't feel it chilly. Whereas I did find this novel quite chilly. In a way, and I'm more drawn to the the perceptions of Catcher in the Rye, that there did seem to be a disillusionment in that novel, but also a sense of some good, a palpable good, which I think just resonated more with me than Desperate Characters, actually.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to see it. I definitely shared that experience. I mean, it was I find it a really fascinating novel, Desperate Characters, and even rereading sections of it, it is so dense and rich and intriguing. So I find it a very, very intriguing novel to read, and I think having got to the end and then gone back and rereading some of the earlier sections, the consistency and the characters and just the kind of little subtle portents was, it really is a wonderfully.
Oh, there's no question about that
in that sense. But I do agree. Still, in terms of just a kind of subjective enjoyment factor or just a kind of warmth, definitely something like Catcher in the Rye just has a more immediate appeal. There would just be something a little bit And both have good realism and so on. I mean, it's not really a question of that, but yeah, there is something about it it's fascinating, but yeah, it is a little bit cold. There is something a little bit cold about it. I would certainly say so. Yeah,
and I mean, no doubt that can be defended by the point that the nature of what she's examining is these characters and extremists, and also the kind of people that they are, these middle class, rather inhibited people. That it's not going to be an upbeat book in many ways. So I get that, and I think in many ways it is a realistic novel. I wasn't entirely convinced by the realism of the dialogue at times. Because I mean, you know how it can, Pinter's dialogue can seem very realistic, and that can obviously portray how people quickly change topic and so on and so forth. But I did feel at times that the way that characters spoke, that they changed topic, and it was almost like it was more to highlight a theme than what people might do in real life. In other words, they didn't really talk on one subject for any length of time. And I know that people do change subject and can make quite jarring changes of topic, particularly when the closer you are to someone.
Yes.
But there was a kind of disjointed element to the dialogue that I didn't feel quite rung true for me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, obviously the characters are so literary, and obviously, and Paula Fox herself, has such a great grasp of language. Yeah. Sometimes some of the scenes seemed a little bit like I could envision them as, more like, it could be turned into a film and so on, which I know obviously they did of this novel, but in terms of just like the dialogue's there's almost a kind of, it's almost a bit too polished in a sense for what really could have quite been happening in that moment.
I mean, we know that novels do that, and that is, they can still be realistic. I think it's just that, at 1 minute, say when Otto was driving to the country home and he's saying he was just thinking about his father, and he goes into some detail. Then then Sophie says something completely off topic, and they're on another. And I mean, I know that people can do that in real life, particularly the closer you are with someone, the less pressure you feel to stick to some topic.
Sure.
But it did seem a little bit too disjointed at times. In that way, in terms of realism.
Yeah.
As I would see it. I think also that, I'm just trying to understand why I can sort of, enjoy Pinter's chilliness or jaundice more than I did with this. And I think it's because I didn't really feel there was any real humor in this book as well. I mean, there might have been wit, but I can't really think, I mean, you could maybe laugh at it's something that's so well stated, a perception about something. But it was not, there didn't seem to be, humorous elements like you do get in, say, Caroline Blackwood or Pinter's kind of work here. I mean, to me, it had there was a certain austere element to it, and overall, and so I can really admire it, I can value it, but I don't think I could be a fan of it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, insofar as sometimes some of the really grotesque moments, it was a bit hard to know really whether you were meant to, as you said earlier about slapstick, whether it was to be seen in that sense or whether it was more, I don't know, really. And there was also kind of, some of the characters had a kind of slightly absurd dimension to them, maybe like our kind of really eccentric artist friend that she goes to visit, and she's cooking clams, and there's this really kitchen with cockroaches climbing the walls. There was that, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't a predominantly funny novel in that sense.
I'm not saying I was expecting it to be predominantly funny, but I think that when some humor is left out, I mean, humor that is integral to the story, not just tacked on.
Sure.
That to me, there is a sort of leaving out an essential part of life in a way. Now I know that Otto and Sophie didn't seem to have that kind of relationship where they had a laugh together, really.
Yeah.
And of course I also appreciate that this was a difficult weekend for them, to say the least, because the bite and the significance of it.
Yep.
But yeah, and maybe, I mean, again, maybe the case that if you or I were around in 1969, when I think it's set in New York, that maybe going to these parties, that it maybe would have that vibe. Maybe there's a very so I'm not disputing that, but I think just for me as a reader reading it just now, that there was a certain austere quality that couldn't quite make me a fan, even though I do admire it and think it's a great novel.
I just find it, just going back to what you said earlier about the fact that Paula Fox was a children's author. I mean, she's an extremely gifted writer. Her ability to write is it really is quite incredible. But yes, I find it interesting the way that she opted to do children's fiction. Alongside this kind of stuff. It's
maybe at some point we could read her memoir, that she wrote, and that could give us some insight into that. I mean, from what I could glean, our mother kind of abandoned her emotionally. Right. So I think that she's as a young child. So I think she was someone that grew up with that orphan's perspective, like no firm allegiance to anything except to what she thought was true. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've got this detached and not very affiliative tone to her writing. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I mean, obviously, because I mean, there is I suppose there's the kind of straightforward explanation that it could be that she just wrote some children's fiction to make money, really, to the kind of pop boilers. That might have simply been that, and this was more kind of her expressing her more artistic vision in this kind of novel.
I mean, I don't really know for sure, Stephen, about the psyches of children's authors, but I would imagine that at least some of them, growing up, have had difficult childhoods and understand the challenges of childhood and want to write for children in a way that helps them deal with the difficulties of growing up. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was one of her motives.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Really, that maybe if you've had that difficult, estranged childhood, maybe with someone like herself, that she had sympathy then for children and wanted to write something that helped them deal with the difficulties of growing up.
Yeah, that's a point. I mean, certainly the interview I read of her earlier on, which, in a kind of latter years, she talked a lot in that actually about that, having the desire to communicate life as it really was to children, and not in a traumatizing way, but not to necessarily steer away from difficult subjects. That was something that was quite important to her. So yeah, I could see that, maybe as you say, she's imagining herself at that age and how she coped by using her understanding actually to get a sense of stability.
Yeah, I don't get the impression that she wrote those books simply for the bucks. No. I think also that one of her books won the equivalent of the Pulitzer, for children's authors. So she won very prestigious prizes for her children's books, actually.
Yeah.
It sounds like if you were maybe her agent, you might be wanting to steer her more to I was about to say to adult fiction, but actually writing for adults, which is not quite the same thing.
No. Yeah.
So I mean, and I get that but then we have to appreciate that children's authors can be very creative too.
Definitely.
But there was obviously something about her that didn't want to speak only to adults in her writing.
Sure.
And I wonder, clearly she couldn't have had quite the same austere perspective, I imagine, when she wrote her children's books as she did in Desperate Characters.
No, I would have thought not. No, I mean, she seems like, you know, I mean, obviously there aren't that many interviews with her that I could really find, but it was interesting. You know, she had a kind of down to earth way of speaking, and she also had a kind of quite amusingly matter of fact attitude to the film version of this Desperate Characters, which I think had Shirley MacLaine in it. That she basically said she didn't think was very good and it didn't really work, but she said she made some comment like, "But it helped me pay for this house" or something like that. So she had a slightly pragmatic, you know, she was fine about it, but she just didn't really rate it. Kind of.
Well, I mean, to be honest, you know, unless you're a sort of Stephen King level of fame and you know, the money that you make from that, most authors do think about money and have to think about it in quite a pragmatic way. So, I mean, how much that's a sign of who she was and how much it's a sign of living as a writer and the pressures of that is hard to tell. I mean, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, she certainly wasn't making a fortune from her adult fiction in terms of them going out of print in that sense. So yeah,
I think, and to be fair, I think you know, if we're being precise about it, it's semi in print at the moment with that edition because it's terrible print. Really,
it was really poor. Yeah. I mean,
it's quite an experience to read a novel that is so crystalline in its insights, but the print is so badly printed. I mean, it's quite an experience.
I mean, I was thinking that I had been sent a kind of knockoff copy of it because as you say, the text was so poor, and it's such a shame because obviously, I mean, again, this is a relatively recent kind of re-championing of our work by Franzen, and yeah, obviously I don't know what's happened with the printing, but we obviously got the same kind of version, and it was like it was.
Well, I knew I was going to get that because somebody had posted a review on Amazon that it was terrible, the print. So I mean,
it certainly is a little bit disrespectful to such a well-written novel.
I think so. I think so. But obviously, anybody that reads it and enjoys it will be able to see beyond that because the novel demands so much of our interpretive capacities and abilities to look at symbolism that we'll be able to see over and beyond the bad print.
Most definitely. And it'll be interesting to see if the kind of Paula Fox revival, you know, does kind of continue in terms of her getting. I know that Franzen had added her to he must have been doing, you know, teaching on a university course, and she'd been part of the syllabus and so on, obviously as part of that. So yeah, I wonder. I mean, it is I could see it could be a really kind of iconic New York novel, even though it is, you know, as we said, a little bit maybe unpalatable in some regards, a bit cold in tone and so on. It is still quite a vivid depiction of the Brooklyn of that time. I wonder what's.
I mean, it's. I think so. I'm not sure how long it will remain in print. I certainly hope it does, and it deserves to be. But I think it is. You know, written in this hyper intelligent, austere way, that could be a potential barrier for it. And you know, in terms of people reading it and recommending it, perhaps.
I wonder.
I'm not sure.
The very famous critic Lionel Trilling, you know, there was a quote from him where he described it at the time, obviously when it came out, as a reserved and beautifully realized novel. So he was a fan of it, but again, you know, even he was seen it, you know, writing at that time in very literary interest, you know, as being on the reserved side. So that may be a difficulty for it. I wonder.
I mean, I think that, you know. Reading it and following that journey, there's much to think about, you know, as we've discussed.
Yeah.
But I think it can be quite a difficult presence or atmosphere to exist in the, you know, is quite detached, hyper reflective and somewhat clinical in the way that it looks at the characters. It is in some way sort of almost like a case study.
I was just thinking that, maybe Paula Fox in another life could have been like a psychoanalyst or something. You know, there could have been.
I think so. Definitely, yeah. I think that she would have had very astute comments to make about, you know, her clients or patients, as they might be called in that world. But I just what, you know, I wonder what a fan would be like of the novel. Maybe you would class yourself as a fan of it. I don't know. Like for me, as I say, I admire it. I certainly value it and appreciate it. I'm glad I read it. I don't know if I'd be a fan of it, but I'm just trying to think about what the typical fan of this novel would be like. As a person. I don't think there would be Otto. I don't think there'd be Sophie.
No.
But because for me, imagining a fan is somebody that has quite a strong and perhaps even intense attachment to something, but this would be a quite an intense attachment to something that was hyper reflective and rather austere. So but I'm not saying it's impossible.
It's a good question. I mean, I think it has kind of developed a slight cult status. I know there was a Netflix series out a few years ago, which was quite popular, called You, which was quite a dark series, and the novel's mentioned quite a bit. The first series is set in New York and so on. So there was a kind of sense of it being a kind of shared enthusiasm. So I wonder. I'm not. I think I'm still trying to process quite how I feel about the novel. I certainly found it very interesting and a very and it's one that I would definitely revisit, because it is, as you say, it's like a case study. It's such a complex delving into the character psychology. So I liked it, but I don't know if I loved it. I liked it, but I'm not sure it would be in my top 10, say, for example.
But then maybe it was never written to be loved, though. Quite well, I don't know if that's what she was really looking to achieve there. I don't think she probably was.
No,
and it raises that thing about, if you look at things in that very detailed and acute way, how lovable does things emerge from that?
Well, that's yes.
So
indeed.
I mean, there is these bigger questions. Really there.
That's right. That's right.
So
yes, interesting. Well, that's certainly we've covered quite a lot of ground there, and obviously that you can never be conclusive in Paula Fox's world as far as it goes. But I think that is.
Well, we're not going to finish the podcast by throwing an ink bottle against the wall or anything reckless like that.
I don't think we've reached that point of rage.
I think that was Otto's level of recklessness.
I think it'll be a more low-key.
I would think that in Scotland that would really count as reckless. It's not like they ever had a rabbi or anything like that. So
I don't think so, and I don't think many people have ink bottles sitting around either. Actually, so
no, not in general, not in the 21st century. Again, so all joking aside, I think the ink bottle and the quill is a sort of testament to his sort of fetishism of the past, but that's another matter.
Good point. Yeah, indeed, that's true. That's true.
But you're getting to the point like, well, don't open up another. No, we're closing it down. Don't start. Otherwise, you're going to get like Charlie Russell still talking about the intricacies into 4 a.m. And you're going to be rather increasingly like Otto.
It would be unfortunate if it just ended with your voice saying, "Look, Stephen, I'm desperate. Can you please, reply to me here? Come on."
Yeah. Well, just to make clear, people might be wondering, what is he desperately asking for? But no, I'm not desperate. By the way,
you're not desperate for a response on that issue.
I'm not desperate in general, actually. So just to be clear,
just to make that clear. Excellent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Good stuff. Right. Well, thank you. That's been good. And
okay. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Cheers for that. Okay.
Yeah.